All right, our next lesson is about something known as the money market. Now, in our previous lesson, we learned about money, what money was, what are some of the different types of money, what's the purpose of money. And just like most things that are valuable in this world, money has a market. People who would like to have it and people who are producing it. So, to understand money better, I think we need to understand its place in this thing called the money market. First, though, we want to talk about some of the ways that we actually categorize money. And by that, I mean this. Sometimes we'll refer to it as measures of money. When we talk about money, we generally put it into a couple of different categories. The first is going to be called M1. And M1 really includes a lot of money that you probably think of as money. So, for example, it includes currency. Currency is just what you think it is. It's paper, bills, and coins used by the public, used by businesses, sometimes even used by government to buy and sell things. And as of the recording of this video, there was approximately $1.25 trillion worth of that stuff floating around the economy. By historical standards, by the way, that's pretty high. There's a lot of money out there at this particular moment, and we can get into why that is some other time. But currency is in M1, and so is something else. The other thing is what's now called a demand deposit. We used to call this a checkable deposit. And the reason we did that was because demand deposits today are money that can be instantly accessed through the use of a check or card. The, or frankly, even now, electronically. The reason we used to call it checkable deposits because is in the old days, really money that the only other money that you could instantly access at a cash register, let's say, other than the cash in your pocket, was something that was attached to a check. You'd write out a paper check, you'd give it to the cashier. Though you can still do that today, more often, much more often now, we use electronic debit cards and sometimes even things like PayPal or electronic transfers to instantly access money. The key to M1 is whatever is included in M1, whether it's currency or any type of demand deposit, it has to be instantly accessible at a cash register. When you're at a store, you need to be able to instantly purchase things with it. That's M1. Now, a very close cousin of M1 is what's known as M2. Um, M2, and this is just sort of an accounting thing, includes all of M1, first of all. But it also includes other assets, including most specifically money that's in savings accounts. Now, what's the difference between money that's in a savings account and money that is in, let's say, a checking account? The difference is small, but it's important. The difference with a savings account is that you can't instantly access a savings account. In the old days, you generally actually had to go to the bank and take money in or or out of a savings account. Today, you can do it electronically. You can even move money from a savings account into a checking account. But generally speaking, debit cards, electronic transfers are not usually able to instantly access savings. Usually you have to do something to get that money out. Economists sometimes call it almost money. It's not exactly uh, spendable instantly, but it's pretty close. All right. And there are other things that are like that. One example is what's called a money market account. For our purposes in this class, the big M2 that we're going to want to remember are savings accounts. Now, is one more category of money known as M3, and that's money that's fairly not liquid. I don't want to get too much into that right now. What I do want you to know, and I just said a word I realize that you're not quite sure about probably yet, so let's define it. The word liquid, or having liquidity. What that means is how easily money can be accessed. M1 is what we call completely liquid or has total liquidity. In other words, you can instantly use it no matter where you are. M2 is nearly liquid or almost as liquid as M1, but not quite as much. If we went to M3, then we would find that it was less liquid. And we're not going to get into M3 in this course. Really, we're going to focus on M1 and M2. Okay, now having said all that, we now need to start taking a look at how do we actually use this money in a market. Okay, so let's take a look at what the money market actually looks like. As any graph, we have an X and a Y axis. Now, the first thing we're going to think about is what is the quantity of money? we always have to have a quantity on the x-axis. Well, quantity of money is just like it says there, quantity of money, but you'll notice I put in parentheses M1. We really are just talking about M1 when we're talking about the money market. So if money falls into M2 or some other category, it's not going to fall into this particular market. So in this course, when we use the word money, what we're really referring to is M1, currency and any deposit that you can instantly access. Demand deposits, we call them. Okay. Now, a second question we have to think about is obviously on the y-axis, we usually have the price of whatever we're talking about. Well, what is the price of M1? And maybe another way to say this is, what is the opportunity cost of M1? Well, M1 is cash that's not in a bank account, or at least not in a bank account that gains something. Generally, checking accounts don't gain, the magic word here, interest. So when you keep money in your pocket or you keep it in a checking account, generally speaking, you're not gaining interest. So if you think of, instead of thinking of it as the price, if you think of it as the opportunity cost, what you gave up, the price of having M1 is interest. And actually, specifically in this case, we're going to call them nominal interest rates, or in other words, interest rates that are not adjusted for inflation. We'll talk about why we use nominal and not real interest rates later on. But for right now, let's just say interest rates. Okay, so the price of money is interest. If we have money, we're giving up interest. And, of course, the quantity of money on the x-axis is going to be everything in M1. Let's take a look at the money market itself. Okay, like all markets, we're going to have a demand for this thing, money, and a supply of this thing. We'll start by looking at the supply. Now you'll notice something interesting about the supply. The supply is actually perfectly inelastic, or vertical, depending on what you might be familiar with. And what that means really is essentially that it seems that no matter what the interest rate is, no matter what the real interest rate is, the quantity of money is going to stay the exact same. And that's actually quite true. And the reason for that is because the amount of money in our economy is actually controlled by an organization. And that organization is known as the Fed, or actually in full known as the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States. We're going to spend our next lesson talking in great deal about the Fed. But for right now, all we want to know is that this organization controls the amount of money, the amount of M1 in our economy. They select the amount they want, and regardless of the interest rate, that's the amount that they select. Now we'll talk about why they select certain amounts, but the amount that's going to be out there is determined by this organization. And so the supply curve at the very least is not influenced by interest rates. The money demand curve, however, is a little bit different story. Here's what the money demand curve looks like. And by the way, you can see how we've noted everything. We can abbreviate money demand with MD, money supply with MS, the quantity of money with either M1 or Q dollar sign. That's one I like to use. And then nominal interest rates can be denoted with a small r. You'll notice the money demand curve slopes downward. Why is that, and what does that mean exactly? Well, let's take a look at another picture to kind of help us understand that. Here's the money demand curve, again, sloping downward. Since it slopes downward, what we know that means is that there's a negative relationship between the two variables being measured on this graph. The nominal interest rates and the quantity of M1. As one decreases, the other must be increasing, and we can show that here. The interest rate at R1, at that interest rate, people will demand a certain amount of money. At another interest rate, a lower one, they demand more money. And again, they're moving in opposite directions, the interest rates and the quantity of money. What's interesting about that is, why would that be the case? Well, the reason for it is actually pretty simple if you think about it. It's something known as, the reasons, by the way, here we go, for the shape of the demand curve, is something called the theory of liquidity preference. Now that sounds very fancy, but all that means essentially is this. Interest, the interest rates that we've been talking about here, is really the opportunity cost of keeping money in liquid form. That's what we talked about a moment ago. That money interest rates really are essentially what we're giving up when we keep that money in our pocket. So, not surprisingly, the higher the interest rate, the more willing people are to take money out of liquid form, M1, and put it somewhere else, possibly M2 or somewhere else. So if interest rates are very high, like they are in this example, maybe at R1, then it doesn't make sense for people to keep that money in their pocket because it would do a lot more good in a savings account or some other type of um, place other than M1. But if interest rates are really low, for example, at R2, then in truth, at that point, the interest is so little that people will say, you know what, maybe I'll just keep it in my pocket so I have it whenever I want it. Remember, liquidity, having cash in your pocket, is really the nicest form for most people. So, what would make you give that up? Well, higher interest rates are what would make you give that up. All right, now that we've got that in place, let's take a look at the question of what would make the money demand curve move? Okay, now again, here's our graph, and this is roughly what it's going to look like when we're sketching out our graph um, in any practice problems or AP problems that we do. Again, here's our money demand curve. Here's our initial equilibrium interest rate as set right now by our current money demand curve and our current money supply curve. What would cause the money demand curve to, for example, increase? First, we should note that when it does increase, we'll note that interest rates rise. So as people demand more money for whatever reason, which we'll get to in a minute, interest rates are going to rise. So why would people demand more money? Well, there's a couple reasons why that might be. The first thing is a change in the access to cash. That's kind of an interesting thought, but what we're saying here is this. The more difficult it is to turn other forms of money into M1, the more demand people will have for M1. So, for example, if all of a sudden there was a computer glitch that shut down all the ATMs in the area, people might be much more likely to keep cash in their pockets because they're fearful they won't be able to get it. If they're going on a long trip to a place that they're not sure will accept their debit cards, they may be more likely to keep cash in their pockets as opposed to in their savings account or somewhere else. So if you believe it's going to be harder to get a hold of your money, you're much more likely to keep it in your pocket. So if it's more difficult to get cash, demand for money would increase. Another thing that causes money demand to increase is income, or really anything that would cause you to spend more. But more income being a very good example of this. If you have more income, you are more likely to want to spend M1. So demand would increase. Pretty simply, if you just have more cash to spend, or have more ability to spend cash because you have more income, you will probably want more cash to spend. So income would be a second factor. And the last factor probably wouldn't surprise you very much, and that is inflation. If a can of soda used to cost $1 and now it costs $2, you need twice as much cash in your pocket to buy a can of soda. So the higher prices are, inflation, the more people will demand M1 to pay for goods and services. So for these three reasons, money demand could or would increase. And every time it does increase, it increases. Let's try an example together. All right, our example here is increases in aggregate demand have caused inflation to rise. Based on that, what happens to the money market and nominal interest rates as a result? Okay, well, if inflation is rising, we just learned that people are going to need more money in their pockets to purchase the things they'd like to purchase. So that means that money demand is going to increase. And because money demand is increasing or shifting to the right, interest rates are rising. And that is exactly what I would like to see you have on your paper. All right, let's try another example together. In this case, a decrease in income has caused less spending. Show the change in the money market and the change in interest rates. Why don't we stop the recording for just a moment, let you try to do the sketch, and then we'll come back with an answer. Okay, let's see how you did. A decrease in income has caused less spending. So then we want to show the change in the money market. Well, if we have less spending, people will need less cash in their pockets, and therefore we're going to say money demand would decrease. And it should look something like this. You'll notice that here was our initial money demand. Here is our new money demand. Here's our original interest rate. Here's our new interest rate. And the decrease in money demand has caused interest rates to decrease. And that is correct. All right, just briefly, I do want to spend one more minute on the shifts of money supply. Now, we're going to get into in our next lesson why money supply changes. Remember, the amount of money is controlled by this organization known as the Fed. We'll talk again about why they do it later on, but we want to just make sure we understand what happens to interest rates when the Fed decides to change the money supply. So let's take a quick look here. Here's what an increase in the money supply would look like. There's our initial interest rate. There's our new money supply curve. And that, according to our graph, would lower interest rates. So when the Fed has a desire to lower interest rates, it will increase the supply of money, thus lowering interest rates. And conversely, when we need a decrease in the money supply, or we choose to have a decrease in the money supply, again, there's our initial interest rate. The money supply decreases and interest rates will rise because of that. So if the Fed desires to raise interest rates, then it does so by decreasing the supply of money. All right, that concludes our first lesson on the money market. Please stop the recording here.